We now have our guest Sam Belfield on the show talking about the Anzacs when we're talking about war. Goodness me, we don't want war, and we certainly need to be celebrating those that have been involved in it. So we've got a lot to learn from Sam today. Good morning, Sam. Welcome to the show.
Morning, Cheryl. Good to talk with you again.
Indeed, indeed. Anzacs. It's an interesting conversation for us to be having because usually it occurs during Anzac Day or around Anzac Day. Yet, you know, it's a conversation that's really something that should be had on a regular basis. Do you think not?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Cheryl. I think, you know, a point in case is that yesterday our 48th Parliament sat and the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition attended the last post ceremony at the Australian War Memorial. And I think there's a recognition in that alone that the Anzac spirit and what's represented by the Australian War Memorial is something that is deeply significant. And in terms of the symbolism of Anzac and the Anzac spirit, you know, I sort of like to think of it, you can pose it as it gives rise to a few questions in terms of, even at the practical level, you know, why is it that Australians sort of get up early pre-dawn and, you know, make their way to their local memorial, whether it's Martin Place in Sydney or the War Memorial in Canberra? What's the significance of the phrase that, you know, that we use in remembrance of lest we forget? You know, going back to the issue of Parliament and our Parliament House, that, you know, the way it's built, it's orientated to face quite deliberately to face the Australian War Memorial, and then I suppose you dig into the issues of, well, you know, why did young men in particular, and obviously along with women, why did they enlist in the armed conflict and that have occurred and peacekeeping efforts, and also, you know, why are we drawn to and do we celebrate the Anzac spirit? And I suppose day to day, ordinarily we account for that. You know, we refer to concepts of, you know, in terms of young men signing up, it's the concepts of adventure, self-validation, mateship, you know, improving themselves. And I suppose in terms of the Anzac spirit, it might encompass, you know, virtues and values like, you know, sacrifice, a sense of duty, patriotism, serving God, King and country. But and I suppose below that, though, I suggest there is a more fundamental reason. There's a deeper narrative, and I suppose that's something, you know, that I'd certainly like to chat with you about today.
Oh, definitely. And, you know, you've already raised so many issues, and I dare say a lot of things that some of our listeners would not know. And this is the thing, you know, with Anzac and this, if you could say the celebration, I don't think it's the right word. It's more the honouring of those who sacrifice, not just by going to war, but by keeping the country operating and functioning while those were at war. And I think that we don't really give enough thought to really what life was like during these challenging times because of the formalities of the celebrations, or indeed the honouring. And so from that, you know, the day-to-day challenges that citizens face during times of war, it's really a time to honour everyone that lived during that time.
I absolutely agree with that, Cheryl. And I think in terms of that deeper narrative, I think that that's something that resonates across the board and why it still resonates so strongly today. And I suppose, you know, when we last spoke, I talked about my work with the World Transformation Movement and the discussion of this issue, the human condition, and the work of Australian biologist Jeremy Griffith addressing that human condition. And a sort of a key tenet of the work I'm supporting is suggesting that where this deeper narrative arises from is that, you know, the human journey, if you like, has been a journey. We've been trying to progress towards an objective, and day to day when you sort of see the coverage of an issue like Anzac, for example, that's not necessarily able to be talked about. But if we can apply this lens of, well, what is this issue of the human condition? What's the human journey been about? It's about, you know, finding knowledge, ultimately self-knowledge. And I'd actually sort of suggest that it's about, you know, the ultimate goal or objective has been trying to bring sufficient self-knowledge to, you know, address injustice, bring peace. And obviously that can sound abstract and what have you, but I said, you know, when you talk about what motivated the people that were at home, not just the people who had enlisted. I think there was a shared intuitive awareness that these threats that were being met, that these enormous, horror and sacrifice was being endured to. There were these threats that needed to be met that were, if you like, jeopardising the realisation of that deeper objective. And so, we normally refer to it as sort of patriotism or duty or, God, king and country. But I think below that, in order to account for the sacrifice, the courage, the hardiness, and as you rightly say, not just the people who, made the ultimate sacrifice, but those at home that, the immense loss and that they had to endure. I suggest that what makes people, what accounts for that is this intuitive awareness that we are on this journey. There is a purpose, and that these, if you like, these world wars in the case of the 20th century are jeopardising the realisation of that objective. And that's what people take solace from, of knowing that there really is no choice in order to, maintain freedoms, and freedom in itself is not freedom's not an end in itself. It's if you like, a precursor, or it's a means to an end, and that end is, by allowing freedom, it allows us to continue this journey to define knowledge and, hopefully address and solve this issue of the human condition. And I suggest that, when people get up early in the morning and they attend the dawn service, it's sobering, it's aligning, and they're tapping into that meaning, and it brings about a contemplation. Well, what are we meant to be doing with this freedom? Are we, day to day, we're, worried about the mortgage and all sorts of practical issues, but it brings us to sort of, to contemplate, well, what are we meant to be doing with this freedom and the goodwill and the immense good fortune that we take for granted? Is there a responsibility that goes with that, and how are we faring in terms of fulfilling that objective that, those immense sacrifices were made for?
Look, there's so much in what you've just said there, but you talk about the human condition, and I just can't imagine what it would be like to go from that euphoria almost of mateship and just the ability to work so closely and cohesively with others that you trust and literally trust with your life, to having to live the rest of your life in the knowledge that some of them had lost their life as a consequence. It's, we do endure a lot, and it's difficult to really put into perspective that, just the losses with the things that we concern ourselves with today, as you said, mortgages and cost of living and this and that and everything else. It almost seems trivial when you realise just how many lives have been lost due to war, and quite often unnecessary wars.
I absolutely agree with that, Cheryl. And I think, in a way, that's sort of an aspect of the paradox of the human condition. And so I agree with your point about sort of not celebrating it. But at the same time, I suggest that there, if you like, on the one hand, there is this immense horror, imperfection. It's just, people talk about the 19th century, the 20th century conflicts sort of, shaking the foundations of Western civilization, the concepts of the Enlightenment and this idea of progress. And at one level, you can look at it and think, it's meaningless or pointless, and it's just a horror. But I suggest, again, we've got this intuitive awareness that while that may be true, there is this sort of line of meaning and purpose that runs through it. And it's just one of those things where, unfortunately, that threat to this objective, this path that we've been on, it's something that we've needed to make that sacrifice for. And, I had the good fortune of attending the Anzac Day ceremony, earlier this year, and I dug out the order of service that I had, and interestingly enough, and I thought it's worth reading a couple of these things out, that we sang a hymn called "O Valiant Hearts," and one of the stanzas for verses reads, "Proudly you gathered rank on rank to war, as who had heard God's message from afar. All you had hoped for, all you had, you gave to save mankind. Yourselves you scorned to save. And then in the dedication it read, "We wish to be worthy of their great sacrifice. Let us therefore once more dedicate ourselves to the ideals for which they died, as the dawn is even now about to pierce the night. So let their memory inspire us to work for the coming new light into the dark places of the world." And again, for me, that, I don't know how that strikes other people, but for me, what's being pointed to there or emphasised is that beyond that horror and like you said, I've got no comprehension of I'm just in awe of the sacrifice and the courage, and just, I'm sure, the level of fear and how, humans just like yourself and me and other listeners, it's to have that courage to stay the course and, in a sense, tap into, I suppose, there is a point here, there is a meaning behind this, and you read about it where this concept of giving future generations freedom, and that's that point I like to make, that it's freedom in itself is not an end. There was a purpose for which that freedom was being protected, and in those dedications, there's a pretty overt reference to there is something bigger going on here. This is about bringing light into the dark places of the world, and I interpret that as a metaphor that we ultimately need to persevere with this search for knowledge and resolve the human condition and end injustice and conflict, even though that may seem incredibly difficult.
Look, just say that again, that to bring light into the dark places of the world.
Of the world, yes.
If our listeners just, remember that, if nothing else, from our conversation today, that is so powerful that, wartime, we can think about it as being a time of darkness, but it's actually a time of light. And it's a time of that, as you say, that fight for freedom and fight for a healthy human condition. I'm going to remember that always. Thank you, Sam. And fascinating. When we agreed that we'd have this conversation, I did a little bit of research on Anzac myself. Having said that, I've been reading a lot about it over the last few years, doing my family tree, and my father's father was an Anzac, and so looking at his war records and the life that unfolded for him as a result, and then the tragedies that take place as a consequence, is it still resonates with me, and I still go back and read and reread, and I'm looking for answers all the time. One thing I learned, though, in particular, is that Tonga also celebrates Anzac Day.
Oh, wow.
Oh, you didn't know that either?
I didn't know that either.
I thought you'd give me the answers. I clearly they fought alongside New Zealand and Australian soldiers and so forth, which I just did not know. But for me, it gives, you talk about darkness into light, it gives light into the whole concept of Australasia and the South Pacific, if you will, and the importance of our relationships with these other nations that really are not that far away from us compared to the Northern Hemisphere, and the distance that we have there, and just how it is important for us to have those healthy relationships, and to think that tiny little island said, yes, we're going to put our hand up and help. It's extraordinary. And I don't know about you, but I've been to Tonga and had the privilege of sailing around the islands there for about 10 days, and it was just such a beautiful experience. But it's such a tiny, tiny place. It just, I was lost for words when I read that. So in terms of the back to the human condition, compare Australia and New Zealand with a small population like that. Where does that fit within the context of your role and the work that you do with the World Transformation Movement? The size of populations and the sacrifices and things like that.
Yeah, well, I suppose very much to your point, Cheryl, is that, again, there's just this, day to day we're confronted with sort of so many, I suppose, divisions, if you like, arbitrary divisions between, races, cultures and what have you around the globe. But again, for me, that if you apply this concept of the human condition and where we're at as a species, and talk about our evolution biologically and psychologically, sort of in periods of hundreds of thousands of years or even millions of years, then when you arrive at looking at the current human situation, if you look at it through the lens of the human condition and suggesting that there's this shared psychological condition where we've got, we talked a bit about this in our last call, where this idea of a conflict between our conscious thinking self and our, cooperative, loving instincts that we've got underneath. And we can sort of, from there, we can have a conversation around how at different stages through, human evolution, different cultures and what have you have, if you like, been at the forefront of, in a sense, taking up this mantle of pursuing knowledge and self-knowledge, fulfilling the potential of the conscious mind, accumulating knowledge. And so you've got, different ethnic groups, different cultures that are, if you like, fundamentally living with this psychological state of the human condition, but at various levels of intensity. And in a sense, rather than approaching it, if you don't come through this gate, if you like, of the human condition, you very quickly end up with a concept of prejudice and division and sort of focus on what I'll call sort of the here and now differences. Whereas if we can step back and look at it through this prism of the human condition, there is this underlying upset. That's, if you like, that is universal, that's shared across all of us. And that really is the issue that, if I suggest from my perspective, that we need. That's a common language, that's a vocabulary we can use, with, like I'm saying, with the benefit of the insights put forward by Jeremy Griffith, we can have a constructive, effective, meaningful, honest conversation about how this upset manifests itself, how you've got different cultures that may have been, if you like, more protected, to a degree from the human condition, and they're going to have certain outlooks and attributes as a result of that, but not arriving at a conclusion where there's, if you like, a prejudice, and that then, inviting conflict, recrimination and what have you. And very much a key aspect of the work I'm supporting is, rather than dogmatically imposing the suggestion, or that, in a sense, trying to acknowledge that there are actually psychological differences to degrees, across different races, ethnic groups, if you want to call it that, and that there's a very good and, if you like, objective, neutral explanation of that, not suggesting that one is inferior or superior to another, but at the same time being able to be honest about, like I alluded to, this idea that at different phases in the human journey, different cultures have been have been in the, closer to the fire or the crucible of the human condition, and there's an associated, psychological upset associated with that. But like I'm kind of, I suppose, emphasise is that unless you come through this gate or apply this lens of the concept of the human condition, then the debate very easily becomes polarised, fractured, results in prejudice. And I suggest what we need is a reconciling understanding, one that's honest, that admits, if you like, and talks about this underlying reality, rather than, in a sense, trying to just render over the very real differences in order to actually bring about reconciliation.
Sam, you have just highlighted exactly what we need to be talking about in our next conversation. You've mentioned some keywords: objective and reality and shared language and shared common language, you said, actually, and so many other important points across cultures and where we are moving as a human from, dare I say, what you said before, bringing light into the dark. Thank you so much, Sam Belfield. Looking forward to our next conversation. You're on 88.9 FM. I'm Cheryl Lacey, and that was Sam Belfield discussing Anzacs and the human condition. Back with more in just a moment.